Harry arrived at King's Cross at 10:30 with a trunk, an owl in a cage, a wand he had never used intentionally, and no Muggle money. The Dursleys had dropped him at the curb, Vernon without a word, Petunia without turning around, neither of them looking back as the car pulled into traffic. He had expected this. He had, in fact, counted on it. He had not wanted the complication of someone he knew standing nearby while he worked out what he was going to do. He had not yet decided what he was going to do. He kept telling himself this. He pushed his trolley through the main entrance and into the noise of the concourse. Diesel exhaust and stone floor, and something sweet from a coffee cart near the far wall, and the particular flat cold of a large enclosed space in September. A cold that belonged to ceilings and not to sky. He found the arch that led to platforms 9 and 10, and stood there with his hands on the bar of the trolley, and the crowd moved around him as crowds always did, without touching him, without noticing him, around him the way water goes around a stone. And he told himself again that he was going to walk through that barrier and get on the train and go to Hogwarts, which was the first good thing that had ever been offered to him, and which he would have to be genuinely deranged to refuse. He found the Weasley family by sound. Someone said Muggles in a low, carrying whisper, and Harry turned toward the voice and found them. A woman with wiry red hair and the manner of someone accustomed to keeping track of a great deal at once, and around her 5 children, various heights, all of them various degrees of the same freckled and ginger-haired. The twins went first, 2 older boys with identical grins who walked straight through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, without breaking stride, as though it had never occurred to either of them that it might resist, and for them it didn't. A tall boy with a prefect's badge followed, very precisely, very correctly, his back very straight. Then a younger boy, long-legged and long-nosed, who glanced back once at the woman before going through, and she nodded at him, and he went. There was a small girl still beside the woman, red-haired, bright-eyed, and wearing an expression of determined composure that would not quite hold. The woman crouched down and said something to her, and the girl's face did the thing where someone has decided not to cry, and is succeeding despite evidence to the contrary, her lower lip absolutely still, her eyes doing all the work. The woman smiled at her. It was a very specific kind of smile, the kind a person gives when they are quite sure they will see you at supper. Harry looked at the wall. He pushed his trolley toward it. He stopped a yard short. He stood there. He was not entirely sure how long. Long enough for a Muggle businessman to pass behind him with a phone clamped to his ear, talking about a meeting, not looking at Harry at all. Long enough for 2 women with large suitcases to go around him with mild irritation. He was used to being gone around. He had spent 11 years learning to take up the minimum necessary space, to be quiet and still and not worth the trouble of acknowledging. He had worn clothes 3 sizes too large for so long that they no longer felt wrong, just like what clothes were. Dudley's cast-off shirts, Dudley's stretched-out jumpers, the vast denim jacket that Harry used as a coat even in summer, because it was better than the alternative, which was cold. He was used to not being looked at. It was the other thing he was not used to. 3 weeks ago, in Diagon Alley, he had walked into the Leaky Cauldron, and a man had shaken his hand and said his name, and then another person had, and then the whole pub had turned toward him at once, and Harry had stood very still and tried to understand the expression on their faces. It was not pity, exactly. Not admiration, either. Not entirely. It was closer to recognition, the specific recognition of seeing a person you've heard about long before you expected to meet them, as though Harry had existed in their world for 10 years as a name, and the name had a face now, and the face was his, and they had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. He had liked it more than he was comfortable admitting. He had liked it the way you like a warm room when you've been cold for a long time, which was a dangerous way to like anything, because he knew from 11 years of accumulated evidence that warm rooms were temporary and the cold was what lasted. You let yourself need a place. You let yourself believe it was different. And then you found out what it actually was when you were already inside it. And by then it was too late to have not needed it. He did not know if Hogwarts was different. He had no way to know. That was the truth of it. He had read his school books twice through and learned nothing about it, because books about transfiguration and the history of magic do not tell you whether the people inside will look at you and see you, or look at you and see a name. The trolley was still under his hands. Hedwig shifted in her cage and regarded him with one amber eye. She had been patient with him all morning. He opened the cage door. From his trunk, his actual trunk, with a brass tag on the handle, stamped H.J. Potter, in letters he had read so many times by now that they no longer seemed strange. He found the ticket envelope and tore it carefully into 4 strips. On each strip, in his smallest and most deliberate handwriting, "I am not safe." Below that, on each, H. Potter. On the back of each strip, he wrote a name from the list he had been assembling in his head, since Hagrid had explained the houses in the hut on the rock, and which had been confirmed by the letter he'd received before the end of July. The letter that had been signed in careful, steady ink by Deputy Headmistress Minerva McGonagall. 4 heads of house. 4 people whose job, as Hagrid had explained it, was to look after the students in their charge. Harry was not anyone's student yet. He was not in any house, and he had not been sorted, and no one at Hogwarts had any claim on him, which meant that right now, at this specific moment, he was nobody's responsibility. Once he boarded that train, he would become someone's responsibility in the ordinary way, assigned, categorized, filed, and the window would close. He folded the 4 strips. He tied them to Hedwig's leg, which took slightly longer than it should have, because his hands were not entirely steady, but they got the job done. He said very quietly, "Take them all." She held his gaze for another moment. Then she spread her wings and was gone. White against the yellow ceiling light, up and out through the high gap in the station roof and into the September sky. Harry stood at his trolley with his hands loose at his sides. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, muffled by stone and distance, a whistle sounded. One long, rising note. He did not check his watch. 11 o'clock. He pushed his trolley to the bench along the far wall of the concourse, the one nearest a pillar. He had always preferred something at his back. This was not a lesson anyone had taught him. It was just something his body had worked out. He sat down, put his feet on the lower bar of the trolley, and looked at his hands in his lap. Thin fingers, Dudley's too large sleeve hanging past his wrist on the left side, a grass stain on the knee of his jeans from the garden at Privet Drive that the Dursleys had made very clear was now his problem to deal with. The station moved around him. Muggles with briefcases, Muggles with coffee. A small boy, perhaps 4 years old, lifted over a ticket gate by a father who did not immediately put him down, but carried him all the way to the platform entrance, still holding his hand, the boy entirely pleased about this arrangement. Harry watched them go. He was 11 years old. He had sent 4 notes into the sky, and he did not know what would happen next. He understood clearly that what he had done was either the most honest thing he had ever managed, or the strangest mistake of a life that had included a number of strange mistakes, and he could not tell yet which it was. It could not be undone. That was, actually, a relief. The station moved, and no one looked at him twice. He was, as he had always been, invisible to everyone who should have looked. The difference now was that he had asked someone to look. He had said the true thing to the people whose job it was to hear it. He would find out what the true thing was worth. Ron found a compartment about 6 rows from the front, claimed the window seat, and put his feet up on the bench opposite. He had a cheese sandwich. His mother had made it that morning, which meant it would be better than the ones he made himself. And he unwrapped it and looked out the window at the English countryside, beginning to unspool, and thought that this was going well so far. The train was loud and getting louder. He could hear older students in the corridor comparing summers, debating something about a Quidditch transfer, complaining about homework in the way people complained about things they were secretly quite good at. Through the glass the corridor went past in pieces, a pair of 3rd years dragging a cauldron, a prefect striding with unnecessary purpose, someone's cat already having escaped from its basket. Nobody came into his compartment. He wasn't particularly troubled by this. He had lived his whole life in a house where solitude was the rarest thing available, and had learned to treat it as a small gift when it arrived. He ate half the sandwich. Then, somewhere just past his compartment door, 2 older boys stopped in the corridor. 5th years, maybe 6th. Their voices were the confident voices of people who expected to be listened to. Saw him on the concourse before 11, just standing there with his trolley. He didn't come through. Didn't board. Nobody knows why. Potter? Harry Potter. Ron set down his sandwich. He had grown up with that name, the way you grew up with weather. It was always present, always in the background, and you stopped noticing it until someone said it in a particular tone of voice, and the air changed. His father had a framed newspaper clipping from 10 years ago. His mother had gone still and quiet on the nights when Voldemort came up in conversation, the kind of quiet that meant she was thinking about something too big to say out loud. Fred and George had made jokes about it on the car ride to London, because Fred and George made jokes about everything. But Ron had been quiet, because the name on that framing was also the name on a headstone, and the headstone was in a story, and the boy in the story was supposed to have been on this train. He looked at the empty seat across from him for a moment. Then he finished his sandwich. The door to the compartment slid open. A girl stood in the doorway with an enormous wave of bushy brown hair, a stack of notes held against her chest, and the general air of someone who had been looking for the correct seat and had now found it. She appraised the compartment, Ron, the 2 empty benches, the window, and appeared to conclude it would do. "Is anyone sitting here?" she said. "Everywhere else is full, or the people were not appealing." "No," Ron said. "Go ahead." She sat down, arranged her notes on her knee with a precision that suggested she intended to keep using them, and said, "I'm Hermione Granger." He told her his name. She nodded, cataloguing it. "I've read about Harry Potter," she said. "In modern magical history, there's quite a long section on his survival. A child deflecting the killing curse is theoretically unprecedented. I cannot understand why he wouldn't board. There must be a reason." Ron said he didn't know the reason. "No," she agreed. She looked thoughtfully at the empty seat across from them. "But it is strange. You'd think it would be the last thing someone would refuse." They sat with this for a moment. She was clearly the sort of person who organized her thoughts into categories before speaking, and he was clearly the sort of person who said what came to him first and sorted it out afterwards, and they regarded each other across this difference with the muted curiosity of 2 people unsure whether they were going to get along. The door opened again. A round-faced boy with blonde hair and a stocky build put his head around the frame, looking exhausted by something. "Has anyone seen a toad?" he said. I've lost mine." Neither of them had. He came in and sat in the third seat and did not say anything else. His name, he said, when Hermione asked, was Neville. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He appeared to have decided that the search would resume at the next station. 3 first years in a compartment built for 4. The empty seat between Ron and Hermione was a specific kind of present, not just unoccupied, but unoccupied by someone particular, someone whose name was moving down the train's corridors the way fire moves along a line, person to person, compartment to compartment, always the same name, arriving slightly ahead of the story attached to it. Outside, England went by in greens and greys, already leaving London behind. Molly came back through the barrier at 6 minutes past 11. She had seen Percy through with a hand on his shoulder and a reminder about letters, and Fred and George together with a warning about their trunk she had not quite finished saying before they went through laughing, and Ron with a nod between them that meant what nods between mothers and children always meant. Ginny was still beside her. Ginny, who had been fiercely brave about it all morning, who had not cried once, who was doing it again now. Molly gave her hand a brief squeeze. She looked left and right along the Muggle concourse. The dark-haired boy was not where she had left him. She stood still for 2 seconds, long enough to feel the specific quality of her own alarm. Not panic, which was loud, but its quieter sister, the one that organized itself into a list. Platform side? No. The main entrance? No. The coffee cart? No. The benches along the far wall, nearest the pillars where the light was worse, and the foot traffic thinner. There. She walked toward him the way she crossed the kitchen when one of hers was hurt, not rushing, because rushing made them panic, but not slowly either. She saw him before he saw her. She saw the shirt first, enormous, pale blue. Whatever was printed on the front laundered away to a ghost. The shirt was the size of something made for a grown man. The boy inside it was small and thin and sitting very still, hands in his lap, the glasses slightly too large for his face, the knees pressed together, the way knees press together when someone was trying not to need anything. She had 7 children. She had 23 years of reading children's bodies, the way other people read text, the set of the shoulders, the angle of the chin, the quality of the stillness. She could tell the difference between a child who had sat down to rest and a child who had sat down because there was nowhere else to go. She knew which one this was. He looked up at her as she sat down beside him. Green eyes, very bright, searching her face quickly for information about whether she was there to be useful or there to be a problem. "Have you eaten anything today?" she said. He thought about this with the seriousness of someone for whom the question had historically involved complicated answers. "No," he said. "Right," she said. "Ginny, love, come on." The leaky cauldron was on Charing Cross Road, and it was dark inside and warm, and it smelled of something roasting, and Tom, the landlord, gummy smiled and kind, found them a table near the back without being asked, which meant he had seen the expression on Molly's face and was sensible enough to read it. She settled Harry into the corner seat, which she could tell from the way he angled toward it was his preferred arrangement, and ordered whatever was hot. She wrote a note in 3 sentences. "Harry Potter is safe. He is in London. He will not be on the train today." She sent it with Tom's owl to Hogwarts. She did not explain more because she did not yet know more. Harry ate an entire plate of food in approximately 4 minutes. He ate with the focused, uncomplicated urgency of someone who was not thinking about anything except the food, which told her something. Ginny sat across from him, watching with eyes that were very bright and very careful. Harry set the fork down. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at Molly, just briefly, the way you checked to make sure something was still there. She had not moved. She was not going to. Hagrid counted them twice. He had the lantern up at the end of the boat pier, and he watched them come across the black lake in the dark, 6 to a boat, the castle blazing with light behind them on the hill, and he counted as they came in. He had been doing this job for 48 years. He got the same number both times, and stood very still for a moment at the end of the pier, which was a thing a man of his size did when he did not want what he was feeling to cross his face. He knew whose seat was empty. He had delivered the boy's letter himself. He had stood in a hut on a rock in the sea and said the name Dursley, the way you said the name of something that deserved saying plainly. The dread settled into the bottom of his chest like a stone into deep water. "Right," he said quietly to the lake. "Right then." He held the lantern up and helped the first years off the boats, one at a time, and he smiled at all of them, and not one of them would have known, looking at him, that anything was wrong. McGonagall read the list in alphabetical order and allowed herself no pauses. They were in the entrance hall, the first years damp and wide-eyed, and gone very quiet in the way children went quiet when they understood that something significant was about to happen to them. She stood before them in her dark green robes, with the list open in her hands, and she read the names, and she watched their faces when she read them, because their faces were information, and she had 40 years of knowing how to read information quickly. She reached the name in the middle of the list. She said it clearly. "Potter, Harry." Silence. A ripple moved through the assembled students, left to right, as they looked at the gap in their number. She waited 1 second longer than the roll required, which was enough time to watch the ripple finish its work. The bright, avid expressions of those who knew the name from their parents' conversations. The blank confusion of those who did not, all of them turning toward the gap where something famous should have been standing. She called it once more, without inflection. Silence. She passed to the next name on her list without any change in her expression. She filed the absence the way she filed everything that required later attention, precisely, in a place she would not lose it. She would address it privately. She was in her office an hour after the feast began when the note arrived, delivered by one of the Hogwarts owlery's own birds, who had apparently received it from an unfamiliar snowy owl that arrived at the tower not long after 11 that morning. The owlery had sorted and dispatched the strips of paper to their named recipients. She had hers now. She looked at it for a moment before unfolding it. 4 words, a careful, small handwriting she did not recognize. "I am not safe." Below that, H. Potter. She read it twice. She set it down on her desk. She looked at the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection and the dark. She picked it up and read it a 3rd time. She had sat on the wall of number 4, Privet Drive, on the 1st of November 1981, in her animagus form, watching that house and that family, and she had told Dumbledore, precisely, in words she chose because she did not waste them, that those were the wrong people, and this arrangement would cause harm. He had placed Harry there regardless. She had written down her objection and filed it in a drawer in this office, and had not opened it since. She had been waiting for something like this for 10 years. She was not glad it had arrived, but there was a steadiness in having been right that was almost the same thing as relief, and she allowed herself to feel it for approximately 30 seconds before she began to compose her response. In his office at the end of the dungeon corridor, Snape had read the note 4 times. He stood at his desk. He set it down. He picked it up. He was very still in the manner he was still when he was thinking, which was to say completely. The boy had never met him. This was the central fact that he kept returning to. Potter had no basis for trusting him specifically, no reason to select him over any other authority. And yet the note had come. 4 identical strips of paper dispatched simultaneously to the 4 heads of house. Not to the headmaster, who was the obvious choice. Not to the ministry, with their forms and their departments and their slow machinery. Not to Hagrid, who had delivered the boy's letter and was the only wizard Potter had spent actual time with. To the heads. To the 4 people whose institutional function was specifically the welfare of the students in their houses. Potter had not yet been assigned to any house. He was nobody's student, nobody's charge, nobody's problem, in the formal sense of the word. That, Snape understood, was exactly the point. He turned the strip of paper over in his fingers and considered what it meant to act before the system could absorb you, to speak before you were categorized, before you were sorted into a box that determined how your grievance would be received. There was a specific window of time between I am arriving and I have arrived, between nobody's student and Gryffindor's or Slytherin's, and almost no one thought to use it. Almost no one recognized it. He thought, with something he would not name as satisfaction, that it was the most Slytherin thing an 11-year-old had ever managed without knowing what Slytherin was. He folded the note and put it in the inner pocket of his robes, which was where he kept things he needed to know the location of. Sprout had been elbow-deep in a repotting when the owlery bird found her. She read the note with her wrists held away from the paper, read it once, set it on the potting bench, and stripped off her gloves. She was walking toward the castle before the gloves had finished falling. Flitwick brought his note directly to the deputy headmistress and placed it on her desk beside her own without commentary, except to observe, "They are identical." He did not need to add anything to this, which was one of the things she had always valued about him. Dumbledore's office, that evening. The 5 of them, which was unusual. The heads of house did not collectively attend his office in ordinary circumstances, and while no one had called this an emergency, the word hung in the air between them regardless. He read the 4 notes. He laid them in a row on his desk and looked at them. "What do we know?" he said. McGonagall said that a note had arrived from a Molly Weasley, who had found Harry Potter at King's Cross after 11 o'clock and taken him to the Leaky Cauldron in London. He was safe. "He sent these before the train left," Dumbledore said. "Yes," said McGonagall. Silence. The fire crackled. He set the 4 strips of paper into a neat stack and held them together between 2 fingers, looking at the wall above the door, where a portrait snored softly, and said nothing for long enough that the silence itself became information. He said he would write to Harry tonight. He would go to London in the morning. Until he had spoken to the boy, there was nothing further to be decided. They should all try to sleep. They left. He had not dismissed them. He noticed, without surprise, that they did not wait to be dismissed. Sprout went first, straight out the door, her boots quick on the stone of the stairs. Flitwick followed close behind. McGonagall paused in the doorway, not stopped, not looking back, only paused, her hand resting for a moment on the frame in a way that was neither dramatic nor negligible. Snape went last, without looking back at all. He sat alone with the 4 notes on his desk and found that he had nothing to say in his own defense that would have satisfied any of them. He was right not to try. Quirrell ate his soup. He had noticed, as the entire hall had noticed, that the first-year roll had a gap in it, a name unanswered, a famous absence where a famous presence should have been. He had watched the students' faces do their complicated and predictable thing. He had kept eating, his eyes on his bowl, his expression mild, his posture the careful approximation of a man with nothing particular on his mind. He did not ask any questions. He did not volunteer any reactions. He understood, with the deep professional instinct of a man who had been concealing things for 2 years, that drawing attention in this particular moment would be the precise wrong thing to do. At the back of his turban, in the dark and the warmth, something turned the information over. It had a schedule. The schedule had been constructed around certain assumptions, and one of the assumptions had just failed to appear. It filed this. It recalculated. It was not troubled by deviation, only interested in it. It had been waiting a long time already. A little longer would not matter. The room Tom gave them was at the top of the stairs, small and low-ceilinged and smelling of old wood and candle smoke, with a window that looked out onto Charing Cross Road and the particular quality of London evening that turned everything amber at the edges. Harry had stayed in worse places. He had, in fact, never stayed anywhere except one room and one cupboard under the stairs, and this was neither of those things, and was, therefore, by the mathematics he had developed, acceptable. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. Ginny had taken the chair by the window. She was 10 years old and red-haired and very bright-eyed, and she had not asked him a single question since King's Cross, which was either extraordinary self-restraint or the consequence of her mother's quiet instruction on the way to the pub. She was watching him the way people watched things they were not sure were going to stay, a careful watching, not unfriendly, with the slight angle of someone trying not to appear to be doing exactly what they were doing. Harry recognized the expression. He had made it at the Dursleys on mornings after nights when something changed, when he was trying to determine how today was going to go. He said, "You don't have to not look at me." She looked startled. Then, "I wasn't not looking." "All right," he said. A silence. Amber light moved across the floorboards. From the pub below came the sound of the evening going about its business, low voices, a glass set down, Tom calling something toward the kitchen. Harry was not entirely sure what he was doing here. He was certain, in the way he was certain about things he'd decided and not yet reconsidered, that he had done the right thing at King's Cross. He was less certain about what came next. He had sent 4 notes, and someone had found him and fed him and put him in a room at the top of a pub on Charing Cross Road, and that was further than he had managed to plan. Molly came in with bread and butter and another cup of tea. She set them on the small table, checked the window latch, moved a candle slightly to the left, and transferred Ginny to the foot of the bed beside Harry without appearing to manage this, so smoothly that Harry was not quite sure it had happened until it had already happened, and Molly was in the chair. "Is there family I should contact?" she asked. "The Dursleys. They'll be wondering where you are." Harry thought about this for a moment. "They don't have a telephone," he said, which was not precisely true, but was close enough to true that he was comfortable with it. Molly received this with the expression of a woman who had been lied to before and recognized it, and had decided, in this particular instance, that it was not the relevant thing. "All right," she said. He ate a piece of bread. Ginny watched the candle. He said, "Who are you? In the wizarding world. I know your name from the station." "I don't know anything else," Molly told him. A Weasley by marriage and a Prewett by birth, neither name going to mean anything to him, so she did not elaborate on either. 7 children, a home in Devon, a husband at the Ministry of Magic. Harry considered this. Then, "Did you know my parents?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not personally," she said. "I knew of them." "What did you know?" She looked at him carefully. He had the glasses too big for his face, and the shirt too big for his body, and the manner of someone who had prepared for the possibility that the answer to this question might hurt, and had prepared for it without telling anyone. "They were in the Order of the Phoenix," she said. Both of them. It was a resistance during the war, against Voldemort and his followers. Your parents joined when they were very young, and they stayed in it. They were brave people. She stopped. I'm sorry. I know that's not much. It's more than I had this morning, he said. He said it simply. No heat in it. She looked at her hands in her lap. The evening deepened. Tom sent up more food without being asked, because Tom was a man who recognized a situation when he saw one and knew what his role in it was. Ginny ate a bread roll with determined composure. Harry ate in the focused way he'd eaten downstairs, not tasting much, just making sure. In the quiet of the room, with the amber light and the sounds from below and the three of them arranged around the candle on the table, Harry began to speak. I slept in a cupboard, he said. Under the stairs. Since I was about a year old. No inflection, a statement of fact delivered as facts always were, because they were true and because they were part of how the world worked. Ginny's bread roll stopped halfway to her mouth. It wasn't very big, Harry said. There was a camp bed in it, and a light bulb, and spiders. I didn't mind the spiders. He looked at his bread. They moved me to Dudley's second bedroom this summer. Dudley is my cousin, because the Hogwarts letters started arriving, and they thought someone from the school might come to check. So for the last few weeks, I had a room with a window. Molly was looking at a point on the tablecloth, slightly to the left of the teapot. They didn't feed me sometimes, he said, when I did something they didn't like, or when I asked for something. You learned not to ask for things. He said this the way he might say, you learned to bring an umbrella when it rained. I did all the housework. I couldn't have friends over. They didn't want me to be. They wanted Dudley to be better at things than me. If I did too well at school, they were angry about it. He paused. I don't think they thought of it as wrong. I think they thought they were doing it the right way. However they'd decided was the right way. Ginny set the bread roll down on her plate without finishing it. She had the face of a girl who had always been the youngest of 7 children and always been loved, who had been carried to bed and read stories and told she was clever and wanted, who had grown up in a house, loud with other people caring about her. And now she was looking at Harry Potter with an expression she was too young to fully hide, which was a mixture of grief and fury, and something that had no name yet, because she had never had reason to name it. Molly refilled Harry's teacup. Her hand was completely steady. He said, I just thought someone should know what I was coming from, before all the sorting and the term and the rest of it, because once I'm someone's student, it'll be different. It'll be about school, about rules, about what house I'm in. Before that happens, I wanted someone to just know. He looked at the candle. Does that make sense? Yes, Molly said. It makes complete sense. She said it with a quality of control that was not the same as calm, that was in fact the exact opposite of calm, but was holding the shape of calm, because that was what the moment required from her. He nodded, slowly. He said, if everyone knew who I was, if people knew my name, if it was in books, if there were, why didn't anyone check? Once. Just to see. Molly was quiet for a long moment. The candle moved between them. Some people tried, she said. Not enough of them. I knew where you were. A lot of people knew. She looked at him. I should have been one of the ones who checked. He did not say it's all right, because it wasn't, and he wasn't going to lie about it. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You're here now. The knock came just after 9. Tom's knock, apologetic, gummy, with the delivery of a man who had learned over many years to bring news without inserting himself into it. He said, "Woman downstairs, green robes, arrived without being seen coming in." Sharp eyes. Molly looked at Harry. He had already stood up. McGonagall came up the stairs at a pace that was not rushing, but that covered the ground quickly, with the particular compression of energy of a person who had been moving fast all evening and was managing it very precisely. She stopped in the doorway. She and Harry looked at each other across the small room. She had watched his face as an infant in the dark of a November morning in 1981, and she would have known him anywhere. The black hair, the eyes that were his mother's eyes, the glasses she hadn't known about before tonight. He had a letter in his trunk downstairs signed in her handwriting. He knew her name, and she knew his face, and neither of them moved first. She said, "Mr. Potter." He said, "You got my note." She told Harry she would return, and nothing else. He did not ask. He looked at her from the edge of the bed with his mother's eyes and the stillness of a child who had learned not to ask questions of adults who were clearly going somewhere important. She thought, "He has had to learn a great deal." She said good night to Molly, whose gaze held hers for a moment. Then she went downstairs and out and apparated from the pavement on Charing Cross Road. Little Whinging was quiet with the particular suburban quiet of streets where people had worked very hard to have nothing disturbing to listen to. McGonagall had been a cat here once, on a garden wall in the dark before dawn, watching a house. She had told Dumbledore, "These are the wrong people." He had placed Harry there anyway. She walked. Privet Drive was a straight road of identical houses, each one announcing its respectability through the uniformity of its lawn. Number 4 was the third on the left. Too neat, she had noted the first time, the kind of neat that was imposed rather than natural, the kind that in her experience often covered something. Nothing had changed. The house was still too neat. The lawn was still immaculate. The curtains at the front window were still drawn at this hour, not because the household was in bed, but because the household preferred not to be seen. She rang the bell. The woman who answered was thin, blonde, horse-faced, with a long neck and the posture of someone who had spent a great deal of her life disapproving of things. In her eyes, the instant she registered McGonagall's robes and hat, there was fear. Quickly suppressed with contempt, which was the most common tool available to frightened people who did not want to appear frightened. "Mrs. Dursley," McGonagall said. "I am Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I believe you know the name." She watched Petunia Dursley's throat move. "It's late," Petunia said. "Yes," said McGonagall. "It is." Petunia held the door at the angle of a person, deciding whether to close it. She did not close it, because she clearly understood that closing it would not solve what was standing on her doorstep. Heavy footsteps on the stairs behind her. A man appeared, enormous, red-faced, nearly neckless, with a moustache that suggested he felt strongly about most things. He took in McGonagall's hat and robes with the expression of a man who had decided long ago that what he did not understand was offensive. He filled the doorway the way he filled most doorways, as though he intended to. "What is this?" he said. "Mr. Dursley," she said. "I have evidence of a child's written statement concerning the conditions of his home. I can conduct this inquiry here, or I can return tomorrow morning with representatives from the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who will conduct it rather more formally. I am giving you one opportunity to account for the statement before that becomes necessary." She said it exactly as she would have said anything of importance, without raising her voice, without speeding up, without any perceptible sign that she found this moment in any way remarkable. The Dursleys looked at each other. They led her inside. The hallway had photographs on the staircase wall, a single large blonde boy at various ages. She counted them as she was led down the hall. In not one of them was there a second child. She noted this, and she noted it in the particular way she noted things she would need to repeat. "Well?" Vernon Dursley said, stopping in the hallway with his arms crossed. "His bedroom is upstairs. Second door." "Before this summer," McGonagall said. "Where did he sleep?" Neither of them answered immediately. She turned her head and looked at the door under the stairs, small, set flush with the panelling, with a latch of the kind one put on storage cupboards. She walked to it and opened it. The cupboard was 4 feet wide and perhaps 6 feet deep. A camp bed occupied most of the floor, precisely made, the blanket tucked under the thin mattress with care, and that detail she had to stop on for a moment. The detail of care applied in a space no one else was meant to see. A single bulb hung from the ceiling on a cord, low wattage, spider webs in the high corners, a shelf with a loose nail, and the faint mark of something that had hung from it for a long time. And on the inner face of the door, in pencil, horizontal lines at intervals from approximately 2 feet to 4 feet above the floor. Dates beside each one, in a small, careful handwriting she did not yet know but would. Not every year. Not consistently spaced. Just marks, made whenever the boy had thought to make them, measuring himself against the only room where he had been alone enough to do it. She stood in the doorway of the cupboard, and she looked at the pencil marks. She looked at them completely, from the lowest, dated 1984, barely a height at all, to the highest, which stopped at 1990, 1 year absent. She filed every detail precisely. Then she turned around. The Dursleys were in the hallway. Vernon's face had settled into an expression that wanted to be defiant, and wasn't. Petunia's hands were folded at her waist. She was looking at the wall. McGonagall said nothing to either of them. She closed the cupboard door, walked back down the hallway, and let herself out the front door. She apparated from the pavement before the gate swung shut. Hogwarts was dark and still. She walked to Dumbledore's office, gave the password, and went up the spiral staircase and knocked once. He said, "Come in." He was at his desk, spectacles in his hand, not on his face, which was the desk of a man who had not expected to sleep. She sat across from him and reported. 35 years of teaching had given her a voice she could hold at evenness, regardless of what was underneath it, and she used that voice now. She told him what she had seen, the photographs with no second child, the door under the stairs, the camp bed and the low-watt bulb and the spider webs, the pencil marks. She specified the dates she had been able to read, the range, the gap at 991. She repeated it all exactly. The facts required no emphasis. When she had finished, there was a silence. Dumbledore put his spectacles back on. "You knew," she said. He said, "I knew it was not ideal." "You knew the family," she said. "You watched that house with me in 1981. I told you with those words, that they were the wrong people. You called them the only family he had." "They were the only family he had," Dumbledore said. "He slept in a cupboard under their stairs from the age of 1. He measured his own height on the inside of the door, because there was no one else to measure it." She kept her voice at evenness. She had decided, on the apparition back, not to let it come out with heat, because heat was the enemy of precision. "I am not asking whether the blood protection was real. I know the blood protection was real. I am asking whether you ever opened that door." Dumbledore was quiet. "The charm Lily left is tied to the blood connection," he said after a moment. "To Petunia. To the house Harry could call home. It required him to return each summer, and as long as he did, it held. Removing him from it, removing the conditions that sustained it, would have left him exposed to Voldemort's remnant. I understand the mechanics of the protection," she said. "I am asking whether you ever opened that door." A longer silence. "No," Dumbledore said. "I did not." She looked at him. He was, for once, not offering anything further. No qualification, no reasoning, no reframing. She accepted that. She accepted that the protection had been real and that it had not, by itself, justified everything, and she could see in his face that he did not disagree. She stood, smoothed her robes, and said, "I will be in London tomorrow morning." She walked to the door. He did not ask her to stop, did not ask her to wait, did not ask her to understand. He let her leave without asking her to forgive him anything. She went. Harry woke up and did not move for a long time. The bed was real, a proper bed, with a headboard and a mattress that gave properly under his weight, and a pillow that smelled of nothing except laundry. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling, which was low and beamed and had a water stain in the corner that had been there for some years, and he catalogued all of this with the care he brought to any new room. The care of someone for whom new rooms had historically required assessment. He was not in trouble. He ran through the list quickly and confirmed it. He was not in trouble. He had not done anything wrong that he was aware of. No one was going to open the door and tell him he'd outstayed his welcome or broken something he hadn't broken. He was simply in a room. He lay there for quite a long time, making sure of this. Eventually he got up and went to the window. Diagon Alley below was just waking. Cobblestones catching the early September light, a cart being pushed toward Gringotts at the far end, the apothecary taking down its shutters. He had been here before, 5 weeks ago, with Hagrid for one afternoon. He had walked into the Leaky Cauldron, and a man had shaken his hand and said his name, and then another person had, and then the whole room had turned toward him. He had not understood it then. He understood it better now. Fame was a form of watching. You could be famous and watched and still be entirely unseen. The watching was for the name, for what the name represented, for a story about a dead set of parents and a curse that didn't work. It was not for the boy who slept in the cupboard. It was not for the boy who had learned not to ask for things. The fame had found him in the summer, and he had felt, briefly, the warmth of it. And then it had put him on a train and expected him to board and go through the sorting and be grateful and get on with it. And he had decided, in the last few weeks of August, that there was something he needed to do first. He found the pub's use owl in its perch at the end of the second-floor hallway, a shabby brown bird that regarded him with mild professional interest. He borrowed a sheet of notepaper from the small desk in the room and wrote one short paragraph addressed to Hagrid at Hogwarts School. He was safe. He was sorry if Hagrid had been worried. He meant this. Hagrid was the one person in the wizarding world who had come looking for him, had come to the hut on the rock and handed him his letter and said, "Here, this is yours. You belong somewhere." And if Harry had caused Hagrid to worry, he was sorry for it specifically. He did not explain the rest. He would explain when the rest was settled. He tied the note to the owl's leg and watched it go out the window, and then he went downstairs and ate breakfast alone, which was, he decided, the most considerable luxury he had encountered. A plate of food, and no one to perform normality for, and no one to avoid. Ginny had gone home with Molly before Harry woke. He had heard faintly, through the wall, the sounds of preparation, and then the particular silence of a room emptied. He thought he probably should have said goodbye. He also thought that a 10-year-old girl who had watched him eat a complete plate of food in 4 minutes the night before deserved to go home and be in a house with her family and not worry about him. Molly came back in the early afternoon. She appeared in the doorway of the small room Tom had set aside for them. Wiry red hair, the manner of someone who had done several things this morning and done them all. And she sat down across from Harry, who had a book from Tom's shelf and was reading it with the focused inattention of a person whose mind was elsewhere. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He set the book down. "The 4 words," she said. "Why those 4 words, and why to the heads of house? Not to Dumbledore, not to Hagrid, and Hagrid was the only one you'd actually met. Why the heads?" Harry thought about this for a moment. "Hagrid told me about the houses when he came to give me the letter," he said. He explained who ran each one. He said the heads of house were the people whose specific job it was to look after the students in their charge. He paused, "But I wasn't a student yet. I was about to be one. There's a moment right before you're assigned anywhere, before you go through the sorting, where you're not anyone's student. Nobody's responsibility. No house can tell you it's their problem to solve. I thought, once I boarded the train and got sorted, I'd be in a house, and my situation would become a house matter. And house matters have procedures and people who manage them. I wanted to say something before that, before I became categorized." He said this the way he said most things he had worked out for himself, without expecting it to be impressive, just because it was the logic of the situation, and he had followed the logic. Molly was quiet for a moment. "How long did you think about this?" she said. "August, mostly," he said. "Once I had the list of professors from the letter." She looked at him. He was 11 years old, in the borrowed shirt from the night before, with the slightly too large glasses and the patient composure of a person who had been making small, precise calculations about his own survival for so long that he no longer recognized it as anything other than ordinary thought. She thought, "He does not know that most children have never had to think like this." She thought, "He probably never will know, in the way you cannot know what it means to be dry if you have never been anything but wet." She said, "That was well done, Harry." He looked mildly startled. "It was just following the logic," he said. McGonagall's owl arrived at 4:30, a neat, severe school bird that left its note on the sill and departed with the efficiency of something trained by someone who did not tolerate imprecision. The note was brief. The handwriting was upright and precise, the kind made the same way for a great many years. 3 sentences. She had been to Privet Drive. What she found there confirmed his account entirely. She was sorry. 2 words, not a paragraph, not an explanation or a qualification. "I am sorry." She would return to London in the morning. She hoped he would still consider Hogwarts. Harry read it twice. He set it face down on the table. He looked out the window at Diagon Alley in the afternoon light. Then he picked the note up and read it a 3rd time. 3 sentences. She had gone and come back and written 3 sentences about what she found. He had waited 11 years for someone to go and look. He folded the note carefully, not left on the table, not set aside, but folded into quarters and put in his pocket, which was where you put things you were going to keep. Molly was watching him from across the table in the peripheral way she watched, which was the way of someone who had raised 7 children and had learned to monitor a room without appearing to. He said, "I want to go to Hogwarts." She nodded. "I just needed someone to know," he said. what I was leaving, where I came from, before I was sorted into anyone's house, before I was anyone's famous person, before any of that started. I needed someone to know what the last 11 years were actually like. He said it without heat or appeal, just as a thing that was true. I didn't think anyone would. I know, Molly said, and then, more quietly, I'm glad you sent the notes. He looked at her across the table. Her tea had gone cold, and she was holding it in both hands, and she meant what she said, and that was sufficient. Outside the window, Diagon Alley went about its afternoon, the cobblestones busy with the ordinary commerce of a world Harry was about to enter for the second time. In a room above the Leaky Cauldron on Charing Cross Road, an 11-year-old boy who had slept in a cupboard under the stairs for 10 years folded a 3-sentence note into his pocket and decided that Hogwarts was worth going to, not because he had to, but because someone had gone to look. The faculty common room was, at the best of times, a room that held its silences like opinions, chairs that had been occupied by the same people for decades, a fireplace that smoked slightly when the wind came from the north, and a set of bookshelves whose organization had not been agreed upon for the better part of a century. It was a room made for exactly the kind of conversation that was happening in it now. Sprout had been in the armchair nearest the fire since before dinner. She was the kind of person who, when faced with information she found morally uncomplicated, was ready to act on it, before most people had decided how to feel about it. She had heard McGonagall's account, the photographs, the latch on the cupboard, the pencil marks on the door, and she had been turning it over since, and had arrived at a position that was, for her, simple. He should be brought to Hogwarts, she said. Now, that's the end of it. Flitwick, occupying a footstool, augmented with a cushion to reach a useful conversational height, looked at his hands. The blood protection, he said, carefully. What protection? Said Sprout. From whom? Voldemort is somewhere between a rumour and a rumour with a face, sharing a man's body or worse, by all accounts. Whatever form he's taken, the threat from him to this child has been theoretical for a decade. She said it with the measured flatness of someone who had spent 30-odd years cultivating things and understood very precisely what grew in the absence of light. The danger to this boy for the last 10 years was inside that house, concrete, particular, and happening every day. Flitwick was quiet for a moment. Lily Potter's charm is real, Pomona, he said. Not as a counter, as a fact he was not willing to leave out. It is not nothing. I did not say it was nothing. I said it did not justify the cupboard. Silence. The fire shifted and settled. No, Flitwick said. It doesn't. The door opened. Snape came in the way he always came into rooms, without announcement, without apparent hurry, as though he had arrived at exactly the moment he intended and owed no one an account of the intervening time. He took the chair at the edge of the room, the one with its back to the lamp, which positioned him in the most observation with the least interrogation. He had not removed his outer robes. He sat the way he sat when he was doing his most serious thinking, completely still. Sprout glanced at him. He gave her nothing in return. The question, Flitwick said, is whether bringing Harry here constitutes removing him from the conditions the charm depends on. If he never returns to Privet Drive. The charm fails, said Sprout. Yes. And then what? A dark lord in hiding who has, so far this decade, managed to possess one person of limited ability. The boy is more at risk crossing a Muggle street. That's not a permanent state of affairs, Flitwick said mildly. Voldemort's situation. We are not discussing Voldemort's eventual return. We are discussing a child who slept in a cupboard under a staircase for the first 10 years of his life, and then sent 4 words to the right people at the right moment, because he had no other option available to him. She let that sit. Bring him here. No one spoke immediately. The plainness of her argument was itself the argument, and they all knew it. Snape had the note in his inner pocket. He had not moved it since he folded it in the dungeon on the 1st of September. He had read it 11 times. Not because the content was complex, 4 words offered no complexity, but because he found each time he read it that there was something in it he had not yet finished thinking about. He had not said this to anyone. He had grown up in a house in Cokeworth, where his father's moods arrived without prediction, and had to be measured after the fact, and managed accordingly. Spinner's End, a row of terraced houses by a river that no longer ran cleanly, in a town where the mill had closed before he was born, and what remained was quiet and diminished, and careful not to draw attention to itself. He had spent the first 11 years of his life in a house where his father was loud, and his mother was elsewhere even when she was present, and where the thing he could do, the way he could make things happen without being able to explain it, was evidence of something wrong with him rather than something worth having. He knew what it was to be made invisible in a place that called itself your home. He had been invisible in that home for 11 years, and he had gotten onto the Hogwarts Express at the first opportunity, and had not looked back, and he had told no one, ever, what that cost had been. He was not going to tell anyone now, but he knew precisely what "I am not safe" cost to write when you were 11 years old. You did not write it unless you had already tried silence and found it insufficient. You did not send it to strangers unless you had weighed strangers against the people you knew and concluded that strangers were the better risk. You did not mean it unless you had tested the alternative and lived in the alternative for long enough to be certain. He had made the same calculation at 11. He had called it something else. He had called it simply leaving, but the mathematics were the same. Sprout was talking about the Ministry's obligations, and Flitwick was responding about jurisdictional complexity, and Snape sat in the shadow of the lamp and listened to them argue about the architecture of the problem, while he thought about a boy he had never met who had written 4 words and sent them to the 4 right people at the one correct moment before any of the wrong categories could close around him. He said, "The blood protection is contingent on the boy calling Privet Drive home." The room went quiet. "He has made clear," Snape said, in the voice he used for everything that mattered, flat, precise, without emphasis, that he does not consider it home. He has never considered it home. The charm does not simply fail when he ceases to return. It fails when he ceases to call it home, when it is no longer, for him, home in any operative sense. That may have been true for considerably longer than any of us has bothered to determine. Silence. Not empty, the kind that fills from the bottom up. The blood protection, the justification, the thing that made 10 years of a cupboard into a regrettable necessity rather than a choice, had just been inverted by a strip of ticket paper and 4 words, with assistance from the person in the room least likely to explain why he understood it so precisely. The door opened. Dumbledore was in the doorway. How long he had been there was not asked, and not answered. He was in his long robes, half-moon spectacles in place, with the particular quality of stillness he sometimes carried when he had been listening and had arrived at a decision based on what he heard. He said he would be going to London in the morning. He said he had received word that Harry Potter was willing to come to Hogwarts. He said that when the sorting took place, it would be private, only the 4 heads of house, and himself, in McGonagall's office. He trusted this arrangement was acceptable. None of them said it was not acceptable. He said good night and left. He did not wait to be questioned. He did not ask whether anyone had something further to raise. He left, which was the reverse of how these conversations usually ended, and everyone in the room noticed, and no one said anything about it. Snape was the last to go. He stood in the empty common room for a moment and looked at the fire, which was down to its coals. Then he went back along the dungeon corridor to his office. He took the note out and set it on the desk. 4 words. H. Potter. A strip of paper folded along its creases until the paper had gone soft at the folds. He did not burn it. He sat at his desk with the note in front of him and opened the first of the marking he still had to do, and he read the first essay and corrected the 3rd line. And he did not think about Cokeworth or about what it costs a child to decide that asking is worth it. He thought about it for most of the night, regardless. The morning came in through the small window. Harry lay in the real bed and thought that he had now slept in it 2 nights in a row, which was more real beds than he had managed in the previous 11 years combined, and that this was either the beginning of a trend or something that was about to be interrupted. Molly was in the room across the hall. He had heard her moving earlier, the organized sounds of a person who had sent word home that she would be away another day, and had made her peace with it, and was getting on with things. She had not needed to tell Harry she was staying. She had simply stayed. He went downstairs and ate breakfast. Tom gave him a plate and a pot of tea without discussion. He ate at the small table in the corner with his back to the wall, which was his preferred arrangement when arrangements were available to be made, and he thought about what the day was likely to bring. He knew Dumbledore was coming. McGonagall's note had implied it. He had tried to think about this the way he thought about most problems, practically, with attention to what the person would want from him and what he was willing to give. He could not entirely prepare. Dumbledore was the person who had put him at Privet Drive, and also the most powerful wizard in the world, and the person who ran the school Harry had just agreed to attend. When things were that many things simultaneously, the best approach was to wait and see what they presented themselves as today. Dumbledore arrived at mid-morning. He came through the pub and into the back room with the ease of a man who knew the layout, and he was exactly as Hagrid had described him. Tall, long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, and robes that moved slightly as though they had preferences about their own arrangement. He was old in the way that certain things were old, not diminished by it, simply present in the specific way of things that had been there a very long time. Harry had learned to distrust things that arrived exactly as expected. Expected things had been used to reassure him before the unexpected thing happened. He noted this about himself and watched Dumbledore cross the room. Molly was in the corner with her tea, making herself unobtrusive, which meant she was paying close attention and did not want to interrupt. Dumbledore sat down across from Harry. He set his hands on the table and looked at Harry with the kind of attention that took something in, rather than simply performing the act of looking, and Harry looked back at the half-moon spectacles, the crooked nose, the eyes that were a clear, pale blue, and waited. "I imagine," Dumbledore said, "that you have things you would like to say." "I imagine you do too," Harry said. A pause. Not hostile. The quiet of 2 people deciding who was going to set the terms. "Then I will begin," Dumbledore said. "On the 1st of November, 1981, I placed you on the doorstep of your aunt and uncle's house in Little Whinging, Surrey, with a letter, because the house carried a protection tied to your mother's sacrifice that would keep you safe from Voldemort's remnant as long as you lived there and could call it home. Voldemort's soul, what remained of it, was still in the world. It was still dangerous. The protection was real, and I believed placing you within it was the right choice." He stopped. He was not, Harry noticed, asking Harry to agree with this. He was stating it as the premise of a conversation they were about to have. "I understand what the protection was for," Harry said. "I knew what was happening to me there. Voldemort didn't." A pause. "Is that a trade you're proud of?" Harry said. He kept his voice even. He was looking at the half-moon spectacles. Molly made a very small sound. She covered it by reaching for the teapot. Dumbledore was quiet. Not the quiet of someone formulating a political answer. Harry could tell the difference, had spent 11 years distinguishing between adults who were listening and adults who were waiting for an opportunity to redirect. This was the quiet of someone who had been asked something that had reached him. "No," Dumbledore said. "I am not proud of it." He set his hands flat on the table again. "I told myself the blood protection was sufficient justification for all the things I was not examining closely enough. That was not true, and I knew, at some level I didn't acknowledge, that it was not true. I made assumptions about a child's capacity to endure circumstances I chose not to look at. I am sorry, Harry. That is not adequate to what I am sorry for. But it is the true response, and I will not offer you a false one instead." Harry looked at him. He had prepared for Dumbledore to be impressive, and he was. He had not quite prepared for him to be honest, and the honesty was strange. Not because he distrusted it, but because he was not accustomed to it from people in positions of authority. He said, "If I come to Hogwarts, I'm not going back to Privet Drive, for summers or otherwise. I don't care about the protection." "I will arrange somewhere for you to stay," Dumbledore said. "The specifics will be managed." "All right," Harry said. He let a moment pass. "What did they say?" he said. "The four heads, when they got my note. What did each of them actually say?" Dumbledore looked at him over the spectacles. Then he said, "Professor McGonagall went to Privet Drive, opened the cupboard under the stairs, and reported to me in a voice she has trained for 35 years to be even, and the evenness made it worse. What she found will be part of the school's record." A pause. "Professor Sprout said you should be brought to Hogwarts immediately, and that this was the end of the matter. Professor Flitwick said the blood protection was a real consideration, and also that it did not justify the cupboard." Another pause. "And Professor Snape said something I have been thinking about since he said it. He said the blood protection is contingent on your calling Privet Drive home, that you have made clear, with 4 words, that you have never considered it home, and that the protection may therefore have been failing for considerably longer than anyone has bothered to determine." The room was quiet. Harry said, "So I didn't even have to send the note. I just had to say I didn't want to go back." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "But no one would have asked," Harry said. A different silence. Longer. "No," Dumbledore said. "They would not have asked." He did not soften this, or qualify it, or frame it as something more complicated than it was. He let it stand. Harry looked out the window at the narrow street. A bus went past. The world outside had no idea what was happening in this room. He turned back to Dumbledore. "I want to go to Hogwarts," he said. "Not because of the blood protection, and not because of Voldemort, and not because of any of the things everyone tells me I'm supposed to care about." He said it without heat, as a statement of terms. "I want to go because I want to learn magic, and because I want to see what a school looks like when it isn't trying to make me smaller, and because 4 people answered my note, and I want to meet them properly." Dumbledore said, "3 of them are looking forward to meeting you. The 4th is not looking forward to anything, as a general disposition." But he answered. Harry almost smiled. "I noticed," he said. Molly set her teacup down with a care that indicated she had been holding something specific and was now, on hearing Harry's terms stated, setting it down. Dumbledore said he would arrange for Harry to be brought to Hogwarts that evening. The sorting would be private, the 4 heads of house in McGonagall's office. The dormitory was ready. He stood. He paused. "I am glad you sent the note," he said. "I know," Harry said. And then, because it was true, and because he had decided that true things were what he was going to say from now on, "I'm glad someone went." Dumbledore left. Molly looked at Harry across the table. She refilled his cup without being asked. He drank it. They walked up from the gates. That was what Harry remembered afterward, when he thought about the first time he saw Hogwarts. Not a dramatic arrival, not a boat through the dark or a carriage through mist, just walking up a path from iron gates in the evening light with Dumbledore beside him. The path curved through grounds that smelled of cut grass and water, and something older underneath, something that had been growing in Scotland for a very long time. And then the castle appeared around a rise in the path, and Harry stopped walking. He could not immediately explain why he stopped. It was not a decision he was aware of making. The castle was simply there, towers and battlements against a darkening sky, lit from within so that the windows were amber, the black lake below catching the whole thing upside down in still water, doubled. It was the largest thing he had ever seen, and it was not large in the way buildings were large. It was large in the way things that had been very important for a very long time were large, a largeness that had accumulated rather than been built. Dumbledore stopped beside him, without comment. Harry appreciated this. Harry looked at the castle for approximately 30 seconds. Then he said, "All right," to no one in particular, and they walked on. McGonagall was at the main entrance, a pair of enormous oak doors of the kind that didn't open easily and didn't need to. She was in her dark green robes and pointed hat, hair in its severe bun, precisely as present as the situation required, and not 1 degree more. She and Harry looked at each other across the entrance steps. "You're late," she said. "I know," Harry said. "I've kept your place," she said. And then, before he had found a response to that, "Come." She led him inside. McGonagall's office was on the first floor, which Harry filed away as information to locate again later. The office had a burning fireplace, 2 narrow windows over the grounds, a good deal of bookshelving, and a tartan tin on the desk, he noted, without understanding why. And arranged around the room, in various attitudes of waiting, the 4 heads of house and Albus Dumbledore. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at them. He had never been in a room with this many people whose entire concentrated attention was on him. It required approximately 3 seconds to determine that the correct way to handle it was to stand up straight and not sit down unless someone invited him to. No one invited him to. He stood. Flitwick was at the near end of the desk, very short, on a chair, with the composed air of someone accustomed to arrangements not designed with him in mind. Sprout was by the window, standing, arms at her sides, waiting. Snape was at the far end with his back to the bookshelf, watching Harry with the quality of attention he apparently brought to everything, flat, unreadable, giving nothing back. Dumbledore was by the door after closing it. McGonagall moved to the center of the room and reached into her desk and brought out the sorting hat. It was old, more old than hat, a battered, pointed thing, frayed at the brim, the tip bent sideways, with a quality of having survived a great deal and not being especially troubled by what came next. She held it out. He took it. "Please sit," she said, indicating the chair placed in the center of the room. He sat. She placed the hat on his head. The brim fell past his eyes, and the office went dark. Not dark in the way of an unlit room, dark in the way of something looking at you very carefully from very close. He sat completely still and waited. The hat thought. He could feel it thinking. Not a sound exactly, more like the sensation of being read from the inside out, like looking through a window and finding someone on the other side of it, already looking back. He had the sense that he was being seen with a precision that had nothing to do with what he looked like. The hat said, "Into the dark. Difficult. Very difficult. Plenty of cunning, and you have had to use all of it. That is different from those who possess it unused. You chose your moment with care. You chose your audience. You chose your 4 words, as a person chooses 4 words when they understand they have exactly 4. Most children would have written a paragraph. You wrote a sentence." Harry said nothing. "Slytherin would suit you," the hat said. "There is a part of you that already knows it. The part that is sitting in a room full of the people it chose to appeal to, and is not frightened by any of them. The part that knew the window would not stay open and sent a message before the categories could close. You would have resources in Slytherin that you will not have anywhere else." Harry thought about Voldemort. He thought about what Hagrid had said, simply, without editorial, just as information, that the Dark Lord had been in Slytherin. He also thought, something he had not articulated before, that what the hat was calling cunning was not something he had cultivated. He had arrived at it through 11 years of measuring dangerous conditions, and its presence in him was as much a record of where he had been as it was a quality he possessed. That it was real did not mean he wanted it to be the defining thing. "Not Slytherin," he said. The hat was quiet for a moment. That was less pause and more confirmation. "Then I will put you where you were always also suited," it said. "Where the courage that brought you to this room 3 days late, and without apology, will be recognized for what it is, and where telling the truth to the right people at the right moment will be understood as the courage it actually requires. Gryffindor." The hat was lifted from his head. The office came back. Sprout clapped once, one sharp sound, and then appeared to register what she had done and looked at her own hands with brief surprise, as though they had acted without consulting her. Flitwick nodded, the nod of someone who had formed a private expectation and found it confirmed, compact and satisfied. McGonagall did not smile. She had a rule about smiling in front of students that had held for 35 years and was not going to break now, regardless of what she was actually feeling. She permitted herself to breathe differently. That was as far as she allowed it to go. Snape said nothing. He had spent 2 days running 2 versions of this event, one in which James Potter's son ended up in James Potter's house, and one in which the cunning that had written 4 words to 4 heads ended up where that kind of cunning was traditionally sorted. He had told himself preparing for the second version was simply professional diligence. Gryffindor. James Potter's house. He noted, with cold interior precision, that he had felt something about both possible outcomes and had not been honest with himself about this from the beginning, which was the part he found genuinely objectionable. Dumbledore caught Harry's eye and offered a small nod. Harry looked at him and did not nod back. "Not yet." McGonagall said, "Gryffindor Tower. A prefect will show you up." She set the hat on her desk. "Your timetable will be ready tomorrow. You are 3 days behind in coursework." The brief pause of someone who has already solved the problem she is naming. "There is a student in your year who has taken notes for every lesson since the 1st of September. She appears to have anticipated that an absent student would need them. You will find them organized by subject and date." Harry thought, "Of course there is," he said. "Before I go." He looked at McGonagall. "I know you went to Privet Drive. I know that." He did not look at Dumbledore. He looked at McGonagall, who was the one who had gone. "Did anyone else come to check?" "After. At the leaky cauldron." McGonagall said, "Just me." He held this for a moment. "That was enough," he said. He picked up the sorting hat from the desk and held it out to McGonagall, who took it in both hands. Then he walked to the door. In the corridor outside, a sixth-year prefect was waiting, with the air of someone who had been told the details were not their business and had accepted this. Harry followed her out without looking back. Behind him, the fire in the grate burned. The 5 adults stood in the silence he had left, and every one of them, in their different ways, was thinking about the same thing. The 5th bed was already there when he arrived. The dormitory was dark, except for moonlight through the tower windows and the slow breathing of 4 boys already asleep. Someone had put his trunk at the foot of the 5th bed, a bed that had not been here at the start of term, but had appeared because apparently Hogwarts did that. Harry went in and got into bed without making noise, which was something he was very good at. In the morning, he woke before the others and lay still and listened to the castle. It made sounds, old sounds, settling sounds, the particular creak of a building of enormous age, making its minor adjustments to the temperature of the day. And he lay still listening to them and thought, "This is a real place." He had told himself this the night before, and it had not yet stopped being remarkable. He was looking at the beamed ceiling when the boy in the nearest bed woke up and looked across at him. The boy was red-haired and freckled with long arms and the look of someone who had not quite finished growing into his own height. He looked at Harry for a moment with the specific quality of someone who is trying to determine whether they are still asleep. He said, "You're Harry Potter." Harry said, "You're the one with all the brothers." The red-haired boy blinked. Then he grinned, which rearranged his whole face. "Ron," he said. "Weasley." "I know," Harry said. "I watched you lot at King's Cross." "I know," Ron said. "We all knew you were there. Then you weren't." He paused, in the way of someone deciding whether to ask the obvious question, and decided against it. "Did you want the window seat? Only I've already got used to it." Harry said, "I'm fine." And that, for the first few days, was the sum of most of their conversations. Short, practical, easy in the way that things were easy when neither person was trying to make them something else. Harry had not had a friend before, and was not certain he was doing it correctly. Ron appeared not to be concerned about this, which helped. Hermione found him at breakfast. He was at the Gryffindor table with his plate and the 3 days of notes McGonagall had mentioned. He had found them on his bed when he arrived, a stack of parchment organized by subject with tabs made from folded paper and a handwriting that was small and very precise. And a girl appeared beside him, with bushy brown hair and bright eyes, and the air of someone who has accomplished something, and is making a point not to say so. She set another stack of parchment on the table beside the first stack. "Those are the ones you already have," she said, nodding at his stack. "Those are better," she said, nodding at hers. "I rewrote them after the lessons to add the context I thought might be missing. I'm Hermione Granger. I took the original notes in case the absent student needed them. I assumed it was a medical situation," Harry said. "Sort of." She considered this, appeared to conclude that sort of covered sufficient ground, and sat down and opened a textbook. "Charms is the most behind," she said, "but Flitwick is good about repetition. You'll catch up." Harry looked at the 2 stacks of notes. He said, "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, with the air of someone who had expected this to be more complicated. Neville was already at the table. He had been at the table, Harry realized, since before either of them arrived, with his breakfast, and his round face, and his blonde hair, and when Harry sat down, he had simply passed the toast without saying anything, and Harry had taken it, and that had been that. He was not asking the questions everyone else was trying not to ask. Not why Harry hadn't boarded the train, not what the note said, not what happened at King's Cross. He passed the toast. He ate his eggs. He was present in the way that certain people were present, who understood that presence was itself the thing. Harry had not had this before either. He was not certain he had a word for it. By the end of the first week, he understood that Hogwarts had a version of him already in circulation, assembled from what people had been told, what they'd assumed, and the texture of a story involving a famous absence and notes sent by Owl. The story arrived in every room before he did. He could not correct it, because he did not know its exact contents. He simply was himself, which was the only counter available. The Transfiguration lesson was in the morning of his 4th day. He sat in the second row between Ron and Hermione, and watched McGonagall place her hands on her desk, and the desk became a pig, complete, grunting, turning its head, entirely present in the room where a desk had been. And then not a pig again, just a desk, in the space of about 4 seconds. Harry sat completely still for a moment. He had seen magic before, had experienced it in Diagon Alley, in the leaky cauldron, on the night of the hut on the rock. But he had experienced it as something that happened around him, performed by other people, aimed at things that were not a classroom desk, that was also briefly a pig. This was deliberate transformation. This was a person choosing to change the nature of something, and the thing obligingly changing, and then it not being that thing anymore, just a desk that had also been a pig. He had been trying not to want things too much for a very long time. He noted carefully that he wanted to be able to do that. McGonagall, surveying the class over her spectacles, paused on Harry for precisely 1 fraction of a second longer than she paused on anyone else. Then she moved on. The potions lesson was in the dungeon, where the walls were stone and the air tasted of something cold and preserved, and Snape moved through the room the way he moved through every room, as though the room had been arranged for his use and was performing its function adequately. He called the roll in alphabetical order with the voice of someone who would be equally precise, whether addressing first years or heads of state. Potter. Harry. Harry had not yet learned how his name sounded when it was spoken by a person who had read it on a note before they met him. It sounded different. He processed this for 1/2 second, too long. Potter. Here, Harry said. Snape looked at him. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds. It was the look of someone who had formed a preliminary assessment of something and was now checking it against the actual thing and finding the actual thing more complicated than the assessment. Harry had black hair and his mother's eyes, and he was sitting in a potions classroom, looking back at Snape with the expression of someone who had looked at a great many adults and learned to keep what he thought about them private. He was not, Snape noted in the part of himself that was not going to speak, James Potter's particular brand of arrogance. He was something else. He was not sure yet what. He moved to the next name on the roll. The spell worked on a Tuesday in the 2nd week, in Charms. He had been working on it for 2 days. The wand movement, the word, the specific combination that Flitwick had demonstrated from his pile of books, the motion that felt like it should be simple, and wasn't, because nothing was simple until it was, which was the central discovery of being at Hogwarts, that magic was a skill, and skills had a moment where they crossed from not yet to suddenly yes. He made the motion and said the word, and the feather on the desk in front of him rose. He stared at his hand. It was not a large thing, a feather rising. It had done it because he had told it to, because his wand and his intention and whatever it was in him that had been making things happen accidentally for 11 years had all aligned into something deliberate. And it had worked. He sat still and looked at the feather floating at eye level, and felt something that had no very good name. Not pride exactly, not relief exactly. Something that lived between those two things and was cleaner than either of them. He had done a thing intentionally that he had spent his whole life having done to him by accident. By the end of the second week, Harry existed at Hogwarts in the way that things existed when they had stopped being new and started being present. He ate at the Gryffindor table. He did his coursework in the library at the table near the window, where the light came in at an angle in the late afternoon. He walked the same routes often enough that he began to notice which staircases moved and which didn't, and which portraits would talk to you and which wouldn't. Hogwarts was a very old place that did not yet know what to make of him. He did not yet know what to make of it. But he was beginning to understand that this was not a problem. It was a process, and the process was already underway. And there was time. On Harry's first morning, McGonagall had given him the briefing he had missed by arriving 3 days late, the rules of the school, the locations of things he would need to find. A map of the moving staircases, she told him, was approximate at best. And then she had said, "The third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to all students who do not wish to die a most painful death." She said it in the voice she used for everything, communicating a fact rather than issuing a warning, and he had understood it was meant to be taken seriously. He had taken it seriously. He had also noted it in the specific way he noted things that were out of the ordinary, not dismissing it, not pursuing it immediately, just placing it in the part of his thinking that he returned to when he was trying to understand how a place worked. He thought about it again in October, 6 weeks in, having attended 18 Dada lessons. Professor Quirrell taught Dada in a classroom that smelled of garlic and something underneath the garlic that he could not identify. Quirrell was young, younger than most of the other professors, with a pale face and a nervous manner that expressed itself differently depending on what the lesson required. When he was writing on the board, he was calm enough. When he was reading aloud from the textbook, he was calm enough. It was when the lesson called for any practical element that the stutter emerged. A hesitation before demonstration, a flinch when a student performed something unexpected, a quality of retreat that Harry could not entirely account for. He had seen adults flinch before. He had seen adults retreat. He had never seen a professor of a subject retreat from the subject. He watched this across 6 weeks and formed an assessment. The assessment was this: Quirrell was either genuinely afraid of practical defense, a bad teacher in a specific way, or he had every reason to be comfortable with dark and dangerous things and was performing the retreat. Harry could not determine which. The absence of information was itself a fact he filed. He spent a good deal of October in the library. This was not unusual. He had been spending time in the library since the second week. It was where the coursework happened, and one of the few places where being alone in a corner was unremarkable. He had a table by the window, third stack from the end, that had become his in the way spots became yours at new schools before you had friends. He had friends now. The table remained. He found Nicola Flamel in November, in a book pulled from the shelf, because its index referenced alchemical protections, and alchemy was a term he had encountered twice in the previous week, without understanding it. An alchemist worked with the transformation of base metals. The central project of alchemy was the philosopher's stone, which could transmute metals into gold and produce the elixir of life, conferring something close to immortality on its user. The most famous alchemist living was one Nicolas Flamel, French, 665 years old, who held the only known stone in existence. Harry sat with this for a long moment, a stone that conferred immortality. Hidden at Hogwarts, he did not know this as a fact, but the third-floor corridor had been put out of bounds to students who wished to remain alive, and there had to be a reason for that specific phrasing. And the reason that fit was that there was something there worth protecting, and the thing worth protecting that fit the available information was something powerful enough that keeping it at the most heavily protected school in Britain made sense. He could not prove this. He set it to one side and continued watching Quirrell. He had been breaking curfew in a minor way since the third week. He told himself it was not intentional, that he became absorbed in the library and looked up too late. He also told himself, with the honesty he had been practicing, that a person who grew up being punished for existing did not attach the same weight to curfews as someone whose life had involved only ordinary trouble. Ordinary trouble had never been his particular problem. Curfew was not, in his hierarchy, at the top. The corridor was on the third floor. He had walked past it twice during daylight hours, from a distance, noting the door. He was walking back from the library on an evening in mid-November when he saw Quirrell. Not classroom. Quirrell, not the pale, hesitant figure in the garlic-scented room, not the man who flinched at demonstrations, not the professor who taught theory because practice made him stutter. This Quirrell was walking quickly with no apparent hesitation, and the quality of the walk was entirely different. Something purposeful in it. Something that knew where it was going and did not question whether it should be going there. Harry had pressed himself back into the shadow of a doorway before he was entirely certain why, which was an old instinct and had never been wrong. He watched through the gap between door and frame. Quirrell stopped in front of the third-floor corridor door. He did not look around first, which was what someone who was doing something they knew they shouldn't would do. He simply went to it and tried the handle and found whatever he found and stood for a moment with his hand on the door, very still, with the stillness of something assessing. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, and Harry stayed in the doorway until the sound of his footsteps had gone, and then stayed there for another 2 minutes, in case. He went back to the dormitory. Ron was awake, reading something at the foot of his bed, with a lantern lit lower than it was supposed to be. He looked up when Harry came in and said, "Late again." "Library," Harry said. He sat on his own bed. He was thinking. Ron looked at him. "Something happened," Harry told him. He kept it brief. Quirrell, the corridor, the difference between the two versions of the man. Ron listened with the expression of someone who had grown up in a household where the word Voldemort was said quietly, and the Ministry of Magic was where his father worked every day, and who therefore had a slightly different baseline for alarming information than most 11-year-olds. When Harry finished, Ron said, "What are you going to do?" Harry said, "I don't know yet." He was thinking about September, the mechanism of it, the fact that he had chosen his words and his moment and his audience, and the choice had mattered as much as the message. He had information now the way he'd had a situation then. The question was the same: who to tell and when. "You could go to McGonagall," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. Not yet. He knew what the first alarm had cost him. He knew what it had given him. He was not willing to raise a second one without being certain of the ground beneath it, certain enough that when he said this thing to the right person, it would be worth saying. He had seen Quirrell at a door. He did not yet know enough about what was behind the door or what Quirrell wanted from it, to say anything that would not be easily dismissed. He needed more. He was not aware that Hermione had been sitting in the chair by his window until a roll of parchment was set on his desk with the quiet precision of someone who has been waiting for the right moment in a conversation that had not included them. "I wasn't eavesdropping," Hermione said. "I was just in the same room." Harry unrolled the parchment. It was 6 inches long, dense with small, careful writing, and it covered Nicholas Flamel, the history of the Philosopher's Stone, the properties of the elixir of life, and a bibliography. A note at the bottom. If you want the section on defensive enchantments used to protect high-value alchemical objects, that's another 4 inches. Tell me. He looked at her. She had her arms crossed, and the look of someone who has already decided that what they did was reasonable and is waiting for you to arrive at the same conclusion. He said, "Thank you," she said, obviously. She picked up her book and went back to reading. Harry rolled the parchment up and sat with it on his desk in the quiet of the dormitory, while Ron pretended to be absorbed in his reading, and wasn't. He thought about the 3rd-floor corridor. He thought about a man who walked differently at night. He thought about a stone that made you live forever, and who might want it and what that would mean. He was not ready yet. He would watch a little longer. By May, Harry knew the castle the way he had learned to know every place he'd lived in, from the inside out, by necessity, cataloguing the things that moved and the things that didn't, and the things that moved on a schedule you could learn if you paid attention. He knew which staircases shifted on which nights. He knew the route the caretaker walked at 11, and the route the portraits took to carry gossip between their frames. He knew Quirrell's pattern, the late evenings, the preferred corridors, the particular stillness that came over the man when he was moving towards something rather than away from it. He had been watching for 6 months and was ready to stop. Dumbledore left on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of May, drawn away by a ministry summons that had arrived that morning. He announced it at dinner in a way that was informative without being particular. Harry noted the announcement and thought about what it meant for a schedule he had been tracking, and finished his dinner and went to the library. He did not intend to see Quirrell that night. He was working through a charms problem that Flitwick had set the week before, and that he had been approaching from the wrong angle, and had that day found the right angle on, and he was absorbed in it. He looked up at 9:45, because a sound had registered in the part of his mind that ran underneath thinking, the specific sound of footsteps with a purpose to them. Quirrell was moving through the corridor below the library window, not the hesitant walk of the classroom, not the careful walk of a man performing hesitance, something else entirely, even unhurried, directed, the walk of someone who was already where he was going. Harry was already closing his book. He did not follow Quirrell. He had a different destination in mind. He went to the 1st floor, McGonagall's door. He knocked. A pause, 3 seconds, 4, and then the door opened. She was in a tartan dressing gown with her hair loose and her spectacles already in place, because she was McGonagall, and apparently she put her spectacles on before she put anything else on. She looked at him. He had the expression she had seen on him before, in the leaky cauldron, the expression of someone who has been paying very careful attention and is now saying the result of it. He said, "Professor, Quirrell is going to the 3rd-floor corridor right now. I've been watching him since November. He was there before, trying the door. Tonight he isn't trying it. He's going through it." She looked at him for 2 seconds. 1 second was how long it took her to decide. The second was something else. "Come," she said. The next hour happened quickly, and had the quality of things that happen quickly. Not chaotic, but compressed, events in sequence with no unnecessary space between them. McGonagall sent a Patronus, Silver Cat, which Harry saw for the first time and filed away for later thought. And within 12 minutes, all 4 heads of house were in the 3rd floor corridor. Within 20 minutes, the protections had been navigated by people who knew what they were and why they were there. Within 30 minutes, the thing that had been wearing Quirrell's face and Quirrell's purple turban had been confronted by 5 trained wizards rather than one 11-year-old boy, and that was a materially different situation. Quirrell fled. Harry did not see this directly. McGonagall had sent him to wait in the entrance hall, and he had waited, and he had heard sounds that were not nothing, and then there had been a different quality of silence. And then Snape had come down the stairs and looked at him and said, "The stone is secure." He did not say what had happened to Quirrell. His face said it had been final. The school did not learn what had happened in the 3rd floor corridor that night. The heads of house agreed not to explain, which was the most information that circulated, that something had been dealt with and was no longer a concern. Rumors existed, but were unconfirmed. Harry was not praised publicly. He had not wanted to be. He went back to the dormitory. Ron was awake. He was always awake when Harry came back late from things, sitting at the foot of his bed with a lantern, ostensibly reading, actually waiting. Harry came in and sat on his own bed, and Ron looked at him with the expression he used for reading situations rather than texts. "You did it again," Ron said. It was not a question. Did what? Told the right person the right thing at exactly the right moment. He said it the way he said things that were obvious. "You went to McGonagall." "I went to McGonagall," Harry confirmed. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's all you ever do, isn't it? That one thing." "It's all I know how to do," Harry said. Ron considered this with the seriousness he gave to things that mattered. "It's actually quite a lot," he said. "Most people don't know how to do it once." Harry lay back on his bed and looked at the ceiling and did not say anything, and Ron turned the page of his book, and the dormitory was quiet. Several days later, the end-of-year quiet descending, students packing trunks, the castle beginning to empty itself out the way it did every June. Harry went outside. He walked across the grounds toward the Forbidden Forest as the light went down. He had been told he would not be going back to Privet Drive this summer. Dumbledore had arranged something. The something was unspecified, and Harry had decided he did not need to know what it was yet, because whatever it was not the cupboard. He stood at the edge of the grounds where the forest began, in the last of the evening light, and thought about the year. He heard footsteps behind him. He did not turn around because he recognized the quality of the footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, measured, and he knew the man would not have come out here without a reason and would get to the reason in his own time. Snape stopped beside him. He did not look at Harry. He looked at the Forbidden Forest, which was doing what it always did at dusk, becoming something that existed at the edge of what was visible and implied what was beyond it. A long silence. Snape said, "Your mother's eyes." He said nothing else for a moment. Harry waited. "She would have sent the same 4 words," Snape said. "In September, 11 years old, the wrong family, the first moment before the categories closed." A pause. "Probably to the same 4 people." Harry looked at him from the side. Snape was looking at the forest. His face was doing the thing it did when he had decided not to show what it contained, which was the only version of Snape's face Harry had ever seen, and which he was beginning to understand was not the same as not containing anything. He said, "Did you know about the cupboard?" Snape was quiet for a long time. The light changed, the last of it going golden at the tree line, then dimming. "I suspected," Snape said. I did not act on the suspicion. I told myself I had insufficient evidence, and that it was not my place, and that other arrangements were in hand. He paused. That is not the same as not knowing. But it is also not the same as knowing. I am not certain which I prefer to call it. Harry said nothing. You were right to send the note, Snape said. I know, Harry said. Not with heat, not as a correction. Simply as a fact, the way he stated facts. Then he said, Thank you for saying so anyway. Snape did not respond to this. He stood for a moment longer, looking at the forest. Then he walked back toward the castle without saying anything else, the way he always left rooms, without announcing it. Harry watched him go until he was part of the shadow of the castle wall. He turned back to the forest. The last of the light was below the tree line now, and the sky above was the particular blue of June evenings that were not yet dark, and somewhere in the forest something moved, and the forbidden forest was exactly what it was. Hedwig landed on his outstretched arm. She arrived from somewhere above him, dropping down in the specific way snowy owls dropped. Wings spread first, then the landing, her talons finding his arm with the casual precision of something that had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. She had been out hunting. She smelled of cold air and the forest. She looked at him with one amber eye in the manner of something that had found what it went looking for and was content to be here now. He carried her back inside. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. That means more than you know. If you want to see what happens to Harry in Year 2, whether the promises made here are kept, and what Dumbledore does next when the cupboard is officially on record, that story is coming. Like this video if it gave you something, and subscribe so you don't miss it. All characters and the wizarding world belong to J.K. Rowling. This story is